Welcome everyone, it's Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive here, and today we're diving deep into one misunderstood moment in world history when Australia seemed to take central stage. Certainly, recently there's been a bit of attention to this moment after Prime Minister Albanese made a big speech talking about how Australia might think independently as it did in 1941 and 1942, when John Curtin famously turned from the British Empire to America in December 1941. You've probably heard the story. Australia's wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin, something of a national legend, boldly declared a kind of independence from Britain, that Australia looked to America, free of any pangs of traditional commitment, and established Australia as a truly sovereign nation by making its own decisions about troop deployment. It's a moment that Albanese evoked when, on the cusp of his own visit to China, amidst tensions with the USA, he talked about independence and Australia thinking for itself, as I discussed in a video linked in the video description below. It's a stirring tale of progressive patriotism in Albanese's telling that Labor politicians, especially progressive politicians in Australia, like to evoke today. But what if I told you that this whole story is built on something of a misunderstanding of what Curtin was really trying to do? That John Curtin himself said his message in December 1941 about looking to America was misunderstood, that he was just a little bit embarrassed by it all. What if his real vision wasn't Australian independence, but rather a fourth British Empire, where dominions, white dominions I might add, like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and Canada, would have greater influence? Today we're going to examine this moment, which is part of the world crisis of 1941-1942 through the lens of John Darwin's imperial histories and the work of an Australian historian, James Curran, called Curtin's Empire. We'll see how understanding this moment properly gives us crucial insights into the dilemma facing American allies like Australia today, allies who are not really seeking independence from the USA, but rather more influence within the networked empire that they serve. Let's start with the historical context that makes Curtin's speech famous and without which you cannot really understand it. By late 1941, the British Empire was facing what John Darwin, the historian, calls the strategic abyss, a four-cornered assault that threatened the complete collapse of British world power. Think about the situation. Operation Barbarossa was rampaging through the Soviet Union. Leningrad was under siege, Moscow surrounded, and Britain was being bombed. Most of Europe had fallen to Germany. Africa was collapsing. Even Egypt, which controlled the Suez Canal, British de facto colony, was under siege. And then on December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor changed everything for America. America finally entered the war. change. Of course, Pearl Harbor was not just an attack on America, it was primarily also an attack on all the British imperial holdings in Asia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and so on. In this moment, Australian Prime Minister John Curtin had in fact only been Prime Minister for 2 months when this dramatic crisis hit. He walked into what was arguably and has often been evoked as Australia's darkest hour, but it was actually a midnight moment for the entire Allied cause around the world. The impregnable fortress of Singapore was about to fall. It was the island in which Australia's naval defence was supposedly protected through the establishment of the British Navy in Southeast Asia. The British Asian Empire was collapsing, and Australia felt completely defenceless, even if Japan did not invade, which was a highly difficult logistic operation. Australia could have easily been effectively cut off through a blockade of hostile forces. 6 million people cut off from the world. It was in this context, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, that John Curtin penned his famous New Year's message in the Melbourne Herald today, the Herald Sun. The key phrase that everyone remembers and is frequently evoked as the statement of independence, of the switch from the British to the American alliance in the midst of World War II, is without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with Britain. But here's what most people miss. This really wasn't a declaration of independence. It was an anxious, even panicky opening gambit, a cry for help almost of a nation that had lost, a country making a realistic assessment of the state of the world. It was also a speech or statement, phrases that Curtin would later complain were misunderstood, and that indeed did not strengthen but weakened his position with both Britain and the United States of America.
Men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan.
Let's look at what Curtin actually wrote in that famous December 1941 message, because the full text tells a different story than the simplified version we usually hear. The text does two crucial things. First, it is a rallying cry to Australia to mobilise for the war effort. It was a complete mobilisation. But secondly, it is a call for a more coordinated effort from all allies, not just the United States, but all allies, to defend Australia and to consider the Pacific War a separate war to the war in Europe. One forgotten part of this call is he actually calls for aid in attacking Japan from the Soviet Union. At this time in the war, the Soviet Union had not declared war against Japan, of course, on its eastern flank. Even though Russia was fighting for, or the Soviet Union was fighting for its very survival against Germany, Curtin wrote, we should be able to look forward with reason to aid from Russia against Japan. Think about that. Australia with Leningrad under siege, Moscow surrounded, is asking the Soviet Union to divert resources from its own defence to protect and uphold the British Empire in Asia. The second, more commonly focused thing is an crucial aspect of this request is that he demanded that Australia asks for a concerted plan and that the Australian government regards the Pacific struggle as primarily one in which the United States and Australia, two quite not exactly peer powers, the United States and Australia must have the fullest say in the direction of the democracy's fighting plan. Did you catch that? Australia, with a population a fraction of America's, was demanding to be an equal partner with the United States in directing the global war effort in the Pacific. This wasn't humility or independence seeking. It was an extraordinary assertion of the Australian importance within the Allied cause. As historian John Darwin noted in his book, The Empire Project, A History of the British World System, from 1830 to 1970, this message was not only poorly received by Churchill, it infuriated him, but it was also badly received in Washington. The Americans had no interest really in sharing strategic control of the Pacific War with a British Dominion. They had been in economic conflict with Japan for control of China and the West Pacific for some time. No matter how assertive and insistent Australia, British Dominion might be, America had its own plan for the war. As I think Gareth Evans might have once told me in an interview with me, Americans tend to tell their allies that they are fighting this war and that the allies will do what they're told. Indeed, by March 1942, a couple of months after the famous message, in the midst of the famous cables debate between Churchill and Curtin that Anthony Albanese refers to in his speech, by March 1942, General MacArthur, the American general, was stationed in Australia as a kind of American military proconsul. Indeed, in the words of military historian Gavin Long, during this period of World War II, when Curtin was Prime Minister and General MacArthur was the kind of American general running the military operation in Australia, for America, the Australian government had, quote, made a notable surrender of sovereignty, and no Australian government would have so completely surrendered control of its forces in its own territory to a British commander and staff. But these were desperate times. The New Year's message was regretted later by Curtin. It can be seen as a novice Prime Minister's early mistake, and the bad blood from his perhaps overly plangent statement flowed through to both the cables dispute with Churchill and later diplomatic relations with both the US and Britain. It is celebrated within Australian nationalist traditions as a defiant statement of independence in Australia, and to some degree, reasonably so. But from another perspective, a more global perspective, it was a case of a panicked remote ally who was looking out for itself, perhaps inflating the threat of Japanese invasion, realistically given all the logistical challenges of a Japanese invasion of a vast continent like Australia, while not seeing the dire big picture of the global crisis, the dire picture facing all the other allies.
While its diplomatic representatives were actually at the White House, while all the democratic powers regarded the conversations as continuing, Japan ignored the convention of a formal declaration of war and struck like an assassin in the night.
Over the coming months of 1942, matters worsened for Britain. Singapore fell, India was in revolt, and there was a very real possibility the old order would collapse entirely. Then from mid-1942 to mid-1943, the turning point in the global war happened. June 1942, at the Battle of Midway, the USA destroyed the offensive power of Japan's navy. Between October and November 1942, at the Battle of Alamein, 100 kilometres or so from Cairo, the German-Italian effort to break the British Empire in two at Egypt failed, and of course control the Suez Canal, its route to India, and above all, at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Soviet Union defeated Germany and turned the war. From that point on, Allies began discussing the shape of the post-war world order to come, styling themselves the United Nations and starting to discuss what the nature of a post-war order would be. The USA and the USSR were hostile to empire. On the other hand, the British, Churchill, wanted the British Empire restored to greatness. He wanted to make Britain great again. What did Curtin do at this moment? He did not, as he did in December 1941, look in a panic to America. He had a plan, but he wasn't really thinking for himself. He proposed a fourth British Empire in which the white dominions like Australia would have a greater role. The Fourth British Empire is described brilliantly and across the entire British Empire project in John Darwin's book, The Empire Project, which I highly recommend to viewers. But also within the Australian context, and specifically for John Curtin, James Curran's book, The Curtin's Empire, is details how exactly Curtin thought about empire before the war, during the war, and what his legacy has been since World War II. What Curran shows is that far from abandoning the British connection, Curtin was actually pursuing a vision of what we might call, what he called, Darwin called, and Curtin called a fourth British Empire, one where the white dominions, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia would have much greater influence and autonomy, relative autonomy, but would remain fundamentally part of a British world system. By August 1943, in the midst of an election campaign in Australia, Curtin is singing a very different tune to what he did in his December 1941 message or his cable war with Churchill that Anthony Albanese evokes. In his election campaign, Curtin wrapped himself in the Union Jack and declared that Australia should be a second Britannia in the Antipodes. He was not expressing a new thought. It was a common, widely dispersed thought across both conservative and progressive circles, if you like, in Australia in the first half of the 20th century. When Curtin then visited London for a sort of meeting of the imperial ministers, British Empire ministers in London in May 1944, he told his Guildhall audience that Australia is a British people, Australia is a British land. This does not sound like someone who had broken with Britain, does it? And what's more, Curtin had a quite detailed plan, a plan that was partly developed for him by his Defence Secretary, and you can read the detailed story of how that idea emerged in the sort of elite circles of Australia in the midst of the war, in James Curran's book, Curtin's Empire. Curtin's vision or plan was for an empire council that would rotate between Dominion capitals and London. He told a Sydney audience in 1942, "We are in the south what the motherland is in the north." We were, if you like, a sub-imperial power. As Darwin wrote, Curtin did not intend the subordination of the Pacific Dominions, Australia and New Zealand, to the wishes of London. Far from it. In the long tradition of Australian statecraft, his aim was to commit more imperial resources to the South Pacific and to assert Australia's claim to manage all British interests in the region. Remember, at this time, Papua New Guinea, in which, of course, famously Australia fought along the Kokoda Trail, Papua New Guinea is an Australian colony. It doesn't get independence until 1975 from memory. It was an Australian colony that Australia gained as part of the defeat of Germany during World War I. So Curtin's Fourth British Empire, his vision, Curtin's Empire, was indeed a vision of imperial regionalism. The idea that Australia would manage all British interests in the South Pacific region, effectively becoming a sub-imperial power with its own sphere of influence. The Australia-New Zealand Agreement of January 1944, and there were a range of attempts by the Dominion states to come up with different plans to have more influence within the British Empire. But this particular one in January 1944 bluntly insisted that any settlement in the Pacific region would require the active consent of Canberra and Wellington. Neither Britain nor the United States of America were terribly impressed. Curtin's successor, moreover, Ben Chifley, made this vision even more explicit. Australia today has become the great bastion of the British-speaking race south of the equator. Strategically and economically, this country has assumed a position in the Pacific on behalf of the British Commonwealth. What we're seeing here is a pattern that James Curran's research, that Clinton Fernandez works also in Australia, illuminates brilliantly Australia operating as a sub-imperial power within a larger world system or imperial system, what I prefer to call a node in a networked empire. Australia was not and is not a vassal. It's an overused phrase. It is not a servant, a mere servant of a captured servant of American interest. It is pursuing its relative freedom within a networked empire, pursuing its own interests while being committed to the overall objectives of that system. And this was not unique to the British imperial period. It's actually been a consistent pattern of Australian statecraft for over a century. Think about it. Before 1941, Australia served British imperialism in the Asia Pacific. During the war, it did the same. It fought for the British Empire as well as the emergent American power. As the debates emerged about the United Nations and the roles of empires and independent nations, Australia very much took the side of the British Empire within the United Nations. By 1949, Robert Menzies, indeed, was actually calling for Australia to become part of NATO, to sort of integrate more fully as a sub-imperial power within the new, now more clearly established American system. But there was a long struggle for British influence as that British Empire slowly wound down through the 50s, 60s and 70s. In the 1970s, there was perhaps a brief period, an interregnum almost, between clear British imperial domination, if you like, and a clear American domination. But really, since the 1980s, Australia has pretty much operated consistently as a privileged node in a network imperial system ever since. This gives us a much clearer framework for understanding Australia's position in world affairs today when we look at AUKUS, the nuclear submarine deal, the aggressive rhetoric of some towards China, but also the belief that Australia helped win over China, I guess, to the American world system, the rules-based international order that Prime Minister Albanese even claims Australia had joint authorship of. These are not really the actions of a completely independent sovereign state, nor a complete vassal state. They're the actions of a sub-imperial power seeking greater influence within the American imperial system. Just as John Curtin wanted Australia to be America's main partner in the Pacific in 1942, today's Australian leaders want Australia to be America's most important ally in, regrettably, containing China. The goal isn't independence, it is influence within the empire. This historical understanding becomes crucial when we consider the strategic situation facing American allies today. Just as Britain faced its strategic abyss in 1937 to 1942, there are growing signs that the American imperial system is facing its own crisis of overextension and challenge and resourcing its vast military empire. John Darwin notes that in 1937, Britain was the only global power in the world with interests in every continent and the means to defend them. Sounds familiar to America today, doesn't it? But that, quote, empires can disintegrate with astonishing speed. The common example, of course, is the Soviet Union, but John Darwin notes that Britain's near total collapse between 1937 and 1942 in war was almost as sudden as the Soviet Union, and it similarly sent shockwaves around the world amongst the elites of its empire, some of whom, for example, in India, took the opportunity to seize, rebel and rise, rebel and resist, and become an independent nation. Others, like in Australia, chose to plan a fourth British Empire to restore British imperial greatness. John Darwin details this. By the middle of 1942, Britain, the imperial centre, was effectively bankrupt and dependent upon American aid. With the fall of Singapore in February, the invasion of Burma, now Myanmar, and the German advance into Egypt, the British system looked set to collapse. Its precarious survival and the eventual victory of 1945 were a tribute to its residual strength, but not the sign of a full recovery. The post-war empire was a pale shadow of its former self. It's also a useful reminder that just because things start to collapse, it doesn't mean they completely collapse or that it always moves in a single direction. Britain did try to resuscitate its empire after World War II. As we know, it didn't succeed. We are not today in a total global war like World War II, but we are in a global conflict of lesser intensity where the USA is facing potential strategic defeat, as Emmanuel Todd has written in The Defeat of the West, and has arguably only got worse since Donald Trump became president. NATO is on the cusp of defeat in Eastern Europe, and NATO includes the United States of America, is principally the United States of America. NATO is principally the military arm of the American empire in Europe. In West Asia, American interventions have created chronic instability and have not achieved, for example, their stated objectives in Iran and Yemen. The failed trade war against China has been complicated by fighting trade wars with the whole world, including the penguins of Heard and McDonald Island, Australian territories. America's relationships with its allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific are strained. America is overextended. Its authority has slipped and is weakened every day by the long habit of unilateralism. It is not just an eccentric personality characteristic of Donald Trump. Ask any diplomat around the world and they will tell you that America always speaks in tones of unilateral bullying. The situation is, of course, different from 1942, but the dilemma for Allied nations is similar to that experienced by the dominions of the British Empire in 1942. They are invested heavily in the American system, whether that's Australia with AUKUS and Pine Gap, or whether it's European nations with NATO expansion and the nuclear umbrella, NATO integration, and or whether it's Asian allies with military bases and defence agreements. The question isn't whether to seek independence from the imperial centre. That's rarely been the real option, or a realistic, pragmatic option for middle powers like Australia. What would America do exactly if Australia tried that on? The question is how to position themselves for influence within whatever system emerges next, or how to hedge their bets in the chaos and the instability as the current system implodes, declines, and finds some new way forward. Understanding John Curtin's real strategy, not the mythologised version, but the Britannic nationalism, as it's described by historians, documented by James Curran and John Darwin, a Britannic nationalism that can be compared to the cultural commitment to the liberal rules-based order that we see today within the global networked empire of the United States of America. This approach gives us a much better insight into the choices facing American allies today. So what is the real lesson of John Curtin's turn to America? It's not a story of brave independence or progressive patriotism, despite what contemporary politicians and some nationalist historians might claim. It's a story about how a node in a networked empire navigates the collapse of one world system. All the institutions and processes and assumptions and resource flows related to that world system, and positions itself in the empire projects to come that seek to replace it. There is a final irony. Curtin's plan for a fourth British Empire failed. He was rebuffed by the British. The British pursued their own plan that Australia ultimately signed up to. But, of course, the Fourth British Empire also failed. It fizzled out in India in 1947, disastrously in the horrors of partition. It was defeated and rebuffed by America again in the Suez crisis in 1956. And limped on through late decolonisations during the 1960s and 1970s, principally in Africa, ultimately perhaps not really ending until, of course, the withdrawal from Hong Kong in 1999. Perhaps it is still not quite finished yet with the withdrawals from Cyprus and Gibraltar. But the Americans moved on and found other ways to exercise global influence as an undeclared empire, a story I've told in my video on the post-1945 world order. But John Curtin did not live to see the failure of his strategy, though by 1944, with Bretton Woods, it was becoming clear. Nor did Labor go on to govern Australia for most of the post-war period. Curtin's empire was buried by then 3 phases of nostalgic Labor nationalist reinterpretation of Curtin's legacy, the 1970s Whitlam nationalist period, the Hawke-Keating consensus period, and the post-1996 period that focused on the idea that Australia contributed to the liberal post-war world order, and that tale is told in James Curran's book, Curtin's Empire. With Albanese's recent speeches and the many people within Australia who are getting their hopes up, I think perhaps a little unduly, that this really is a statement of independence from Australia. We hear recycled stories of these legends. But I think, as I've said in my video on Albanese's speech on progressive patriotism, he has failed to see the history of John Curtin, of the world crisis of 1942, as it really was. The failure of Curtin's empire is the real message that progressive patriots in Australia, around the world, people who are hoping to perhaps plan a project for a fourth American empire after Donald Trump. That's the real message these people should take home. Australia is again seeking to prop up a defeated world imperial system that is breaking down, while insisting the empire can rule the world from the White House Situation Room for a few more generations and make America great again. Australia would do better to abandon the American-imagined rules-based order, the Trump-imagined American greatness, and live in the complex realities, the complex plural realities of the world as it is. Thanks for watching. Do like, share and subscribe, and go over to jeffrich.substack.com where you can read more of my interpretations of world history and my world tour of world powers, the United States, China, India, the current focus at Substack, Russia and Europe at jeffrich.substack.com. Thanks for watching.